All right, so let's dig a little bit more into a series and see what we can do with a series. All right, so first of all, instead of using a series from the airlines data, let's go ahead and we're just going to create a series from scratch. So let's go ahead. What we can do to create a series, right? One option is we can have a list. So recall that a series can be thought of like a list, except it's got some special attributes to it. Basically, it has additional variables and methods attached to it, along with a unique index setup. Right. So what I can do is I can have this list over here, which is just a list of 5 numbers from 10 to 50, and I can go ahead and create a series using the PD series option, and I can just pass my list in there. Right. And so now we have our list, or excuse me, we have our series. Now, there are a few things you'll notice in our series. Well, one, we have our values, okay? So the values that were inside of our list, right? We now see them in our series column here. We also have this little printout at the end called dtype, right? So this just shows us what is the data type. And in this case, we have integers, right? So if these were floating point values, then the dtype would be floats. If these were character strings, then the dtype would be strings. All right. And the last thing that's a little bit unique from what we saw with our list is that we have this index to the left. Right. This is just the numeric location for each of the rows or the elements within our series, and we'll see in a little bit how we can use that information. All right, so if we go back to our data frame, our airlines data frame we created earlier, and if we were to do the same thing and print this out, we would see we have similar information, except we have our column of information here on the right, we have our index values on the left, and in this case we have dtype, and it says object. And that's because the actual element data in here are strings, right? And within pandas, when you have strings as columns or as the single column in a series, it refers to that dtype as an object. So when you see dtype equals object, just think of it as a string. Okay, so we saw that we have these index values, and every series has an index, and similarly, every data frame has an index. And we can think of an index as a way to reference each element, right? So we can always reference each one of these elements using these index values. And so the way to think about this is similar to a dictionary, where we have a key value pair, right? Where the key would be the index value, and the value pair would be the actual element in that series. Right? So in a normal series, when we just create a default series or a data frame, the actual index is this range index. And this is value starting at 0, and it'll stop at however many elements you have minus 1. Okay? Now, we can use this information, and we can use this information to access individual elements. So in our slide here, we see we want to access this number 40. And so if we do the bracket notation, such as the normal indexing procedure, and we pass 3, note we're passing 3, that's the index value we want to extract. And we get the value 40 as our output. So this behaves very similar to the indexing procedure that we have seen before with data frames and lists and so on. Now, what is unique is that our index values don't just need to be numbers, right? We can actually change the index values, right? For example, we can go ahead and we can set the index, right? So we can do s index. If I do that, that'll tell me what my current index values are, which it just says range index, starts at 0 and stops at but does not include 5. But I want to assign new index values to that. And I can do that by just giving it a list of the new values. And these values can be anything. They could be numbers, both integers, floating point. They could be, in this case, strings. And now when I look at my series, now I have my index values are what I supplied it here. Right? Now we can explicitly index for these locations. So say I want to look up the value 40, right? That's right here. This value 40, it's aligned to the index value D. So what I would do is go ahead and just index for that. And it is going to identify that index value and extract the value. Now here's a unique thing. And this is something you need to be aware of, is we can actually have duplicate index values, right? So now let's look at our series, and we see we actually can have an index value repeated, right? So now what happens if I were to index for this is it would get all the values in my series that align to this index key, okay? Right. So recall that our data frame from earlier when we imported the airlines data, we have two columns, carrier and name. So we saw earlier that we can index for the first row of our data frame. And if you recall, what do we get in return? We get a series, right? So that row is actually a series. And before we name this first row, now here's the thing is our row, we can actually see that we have names for the information within our series, right? We have the name of the carrier and the name of, or the carrier identifier and the name of that carrier, right? And this can be handy because we can actually use this information to continue extracting elements from that series, right? So I could say I want to get the carrier, the value of the carrier out. And when we do that indexing, we get 9E, right? And if you recall, we had the other option, which was name. Whoops. And we see the name is Endeavor Air Inc. All right, so this gives a quick introduction to series and how we can especially use indexes to or indices to extract information from it. Next, what we're going to do is jump into how this builds on to data frames and how can we use data frame index values to do different types of extraction of information.